Welcome to Meshmen Studio. So yeah, I'm gonna hang out here with some Renderman work here and yeah, have some fun. And we're gonna be like introduction to Renderman. So yeah, let's dive into it and see what's gonna happen today. It's gonna be a quick one here, maybe 40 minutes or something, hanging out here, just going through some Renderman introduction stuff. So yeah, let's dive into it. So yeah, let's see here. Yeah, so this is the setup that we gonna start. It's a new series, so I'm gonna look here into the Renderman related stuff. So we have previously texted this one in Mari, and let me just disable my notifications on my phone here. And so I'm gonna actually have a beer here, so let's open up a beer so we get into the mood. It's a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, and let's get cracking. I got my Meshmen Studio mug here. It's really good to have one of those when you drink. Cheers. A lot of foam on this one. Okay, let's get going. So yeah, I wanna take a look here at this scene. So it's already rendering here, Renderman. So this is what we're gonna get into in a few episodes, and I'm gonna start up just to look at this, but I'm gonna then now just slightly step back and go through the basics of Renderman before we get into this state. But this is essentially what we're gonna do in this live series. So I previously textured this one in Mari, and now I want to take a look at how we can render it in Renderman. So let's see, do we have any people in the chat here? Yeah, there's a few. How many UDIMs? Yeah, we can take a look at that. Let me just pause the rendering here and take a look in the render view here. So let's go to my UV editing and take a look at this guy. Let me see here. Where is my outliner? Let me see. There you go. It's 46 UDIMs in this guy. Sound good. That's good. So yeah, this is the asset that we're gonna take into lookdev, but today it's gonna be more about how we can use Renderman, the basics here for people that's not new to Renderman. So yeah, first off, let's actually start a new scene. So we can briefly just take a look at it. This one is very basic, my scene here essentially. So let's go into Hypershade first and take a look. This is essentially my setup. So we have a shader, we have a shading group, we have some displacement going here, and this is texture read nodes, and this is the Renderman shader. But that's something we're gonna come to in the next episode. So I want to take a step back here and just take the basics from the start here. So let me just take an open scene here. Take my stream here and hit start. I believe I actually textured, so the question was 2K or 4K. So I textured this a long time ago. I believe I textured it in 2K, but that's not really an issue for Mori. So yeah, it's kind of a dirty, really old asset here that I just took here. Let me see, I believe I have my selection highlighting off here. Yeah, so first off, in Renderman, when you have it loaded here, you have this, I have Renderman 23.3 loaded. There is a 23.4, I haven't installed it yet. But you will have a shelf here. So this is the Renderman shelf. So you have, this one is essentially when you render current frame or IPR rendering. So that's, if you hit this one, this little eye here, that's open up it. And that's the Renderman render view, essentially, this guy. And if I would render this frame here, let me see here, if I do that and start to render it, see here, render, I have something here, essentially have a curvature pattern going on to this guy. So let's see here, if I select this guy and hit this round icon with a star, and that's something that applies the shader. So let's do that. We can right click and say Pixar Surface, and that applies a Pixar Surface shader onto this one. I'm gonna close this window now and actually, instead of using this one, actually render in the render view directly here. So we have this, if I, under the renderer here, you can say Arnold, or when you have Renderman, you can say Renderman as well. So if I now start to render here, it will fire up and render, let me see here, I think it has to go through, I don't have any lights enabled. Let's actually delete the light. So you see here, I don't have any light and nothing is rendering. Let's enable the light. So after the render view and the IPR window and the it and the local queue here, we see these light icons. So if I now take this dome light, if I press this button, you can see what happens. And you see here now, we have this white dome. And essentially, if I zoom out here, or if I go to viewport, we can see here, if I zoom out, it's essentially a sphere that just surrounds now. So this is the environment light. The environment light is a way to enable HDR lighting, so we can just plug in a HDR map into this path here, or in my case, for example, let's browse and take this one, and we have one of my HDRs here. So this is a really old place I worked at, Fido. This is there, I took an HDR inside the server room, so there was a lot of storage in this server room. And now if I render, we will get something here. Let's see, go to Renderman again. And there we see we have now a rendering here with the HDR. We can go here. If I select my dome light, I can set the exposure, overcrank it, like so. Good beer. So yeah, let's delete the dome light. Let's take something else. Let's take some of the other lights and see what we have here. If I right click, we can see here we have rectangular light, disc lights, distant. So this is different type of lights. So rectangular lights is probably one of the most common lights of the environment. So let's see here, if I now just raise this one, scale it up, we can see here, we can start to see something here. Let's do that, just raise it up here a bit. If I hit the T button, I can get, you know, like a target gizmo here. So I can start to angle this light here. Let's create the ground so we have something to, let's say, polygon plane. Just need to scale it up. And now we need to increase the exposure on this light because it's essentially 0 exposure, so it's going to be very dim here. So let's crank this up. And let me see, shading, I want to have a smooth shaded. Let me take my light again here and start to swivel it around. Whoa. There you go. Yeah, so there we have a light, and we can now start to interact with it. So we have the exposure, that's the exposure, and it's physically correct. It's with quadratic fall off by default. And if you want to start to, we can color the lights as any lights really, like so. But what I usually do when I control lights is sometimes I use something called kelvins. So we have this enable temperature. So a daylight is usually 6,500 kelvins. And if I, like for example, you can have something like called tungsten lights, and they are, 3,000-ish kelvins, and it's orange. So this is more like the photographic way of dealing with temperature on lights. If you untick it, it's going to take the color of the lights there. And you can also insert color maps, for example, like almost like a stained glass or something, that you pick up lights from the map. Let me see here. Let's take another type of light, like a distant light that's simulating sunlight. So it's essentially, if I take my rectangular light and just hide it, for example. A distant light is a light that doesn't have a, it's very linear. It's simulating the sun really. And you see, if I scale this up, nothing happens here. It's just an angle, and it doesn't really matter where in the scene I have this light. It's just, the only thing that's important is the angle of the light. Essentially a sunlight, and it doesn't have a fall off like another light. For example, if I hide this one and enable my rectangular light, you can see here, this one has a fall off. You see the exposure here essentially has a quadratic fall off. So that means like you have to, was it 4 times the intensity on a distance, kind of, or something like that. So you see, the closer you are, the more intense it gets. And if you take it away really far, it's just going to become dimmer and dimmer. But this distant light is just a constant, essentially mimicking the sun. But yeah, essentially the sun is not constant either, but it's so far away. So it's the distance between the Earth and the sun, and wherever you are on Earth is going to be so small, so it's gonna be essentially feeling like a constant or a linear fall off. So let's take this one. Okay, so we have a few people in the chat. So yeah, I'm gonna do some of these live streams coming up here with this asset, and I'm also gonna later on take it into using Houdini for Renderman and Solaris as well. That's my goal. At the moment now, I just want to take a look here at the Maya side, and then later on take it into Houdini as well. Okay, let's take a disk light. So that's, as the rectangular light is just a round light. Same settings as the rectangular light. Exposure as well. So yeah, you can use something called light filters on light. So that's different way to essentially feather off light. So if you're on a set, if you look at the movie set, you can see that there's a lot of, when you're on a set, you can see you have lights, and usually you have something called a gobo. So that's, a gobo is something in a cinematic term is called go between objects. So you usually have a light and then you feather off light. So you might take a black cloth or something to wedge off the light, and that's something you can do here as well in CG. So let's take a look at that. So a light filter, let's take this disk light and say here, let's take a gobo light filter. So we have this guy now. So let's see here. Oops. Rat grid. Where did it go? Ooh. Let's scale it up. There you go. So you can see here, it's essentially a way to block off light. You can see, okay, I want to feather off light here. I just want to do like a corridor of light essentially. So let's enable that grid there, and you can add more of them. So let's add let me see here. I go back. I want to have another gobo. Now I have 2 of them. And something strange happened there. So you should be able to have 2 of them. Let me see here. What did I miss? Should be able to have a bunch of them. Let me redo that. Let me take direct light and see here. So I want to have my gobo. There we go. I'm not doing something wrong here. Strange. There's something wrong with my light there. Oh, that's the way. Okay, my bad. Okay, think something is funky here. I have to come back to that. Or let's see here. Let's restart my scene here. I think I made something wrong there. Let me see here. Probably messed something up. Okay, let's do this. Rectangular light. I'm just gonna place it like so. Okay, in the ground. There you go. Okay, let's start to render this. Just gonna hit Renderman there. Okay, so let's apply a maybe shader there as well. Okay, we're back. Okay, so let's take this guy and apply a gobo. I'm not sure why it doesn't block the light there. It should do. How old am I? I'm 48. Let me see here. What's up with my... It's like it's... Okay, never mind. I have to investigate this further. It worked with my disk light. That's the very strange thing. Let's take the disk light again. Why is that not working as I expected? It's typical. Okay, there we go. Gobo. Interesting. Why is this one working and the other one not? I have to investigate that. Anyway, that's interesting. So that it works on my disk light. Okay. You can add more here. So append, and then you can take another one. So this is what I was about to demonstrate. I don't know why it doesn't work on that rectangular light. I have to investigate that further. But here you can see, you can start to feather off like it would be like a set or something. Let's say that you wanna just make a shaft of light or something like you usually can do on a set. So you can just place these instead of building like a full geometry. You can start to do it like this. Take my disk light, move it further away, and then we have to increase exposure to compensate. Yeah, so you can feather off lights using those different light filters. So let's delete those. So let's take my environment light now. Let's take that HDR we saw earlier. Okay, so we have mesh lights as well. So what's a mesh light? That's you can turn a mesh into a light essentially. So let's say that you wanna create, let's say that these guys, for example, let's create a mesh light out of these. So select the geometry and hit this guy there. That's like a sphere with a wireframe. And now if I exposure here up, you can see that they become like glowing objects. So generally mesh lights is, if I turn on my dome light, it produces quite a lot of noise can do. It's not as optimal as a if I would create this rectangular light here. This is essentially, it's called analytic lights. And these lights are more optimized for rendering than a mesh is, because the mesh light has to calculate the geometry, and there's a lot more involved to actually illuminate from a volume or a geometry than one of these other type of lights that we can see here. So I rarely use mesh lights. I avoid it if I can, because it usually generates more noise. And but on the asset here we can see my rect light here. If I go back to my mesh lights, you can see here we don't have any lights here, so they actually live here as a Pixar black body. So if I go in here to the object, if I select the object and go here, we can see here in the construction history, we see here up here in the corner, we see a Pixar black one. If I go into this one, this is where we have the exposure. So it's essentially now lives onto the object, and it applies a black body material to give these options to enable from the object. Let me see here. Where are those? Can I delete this one? I think so. Yeah. No. Let me go to my, let's see, how did I delete those now again? I never used them. Let me go into Hypershade and see if I have it there. Should be on the lights, I guess. Now it's gone. That didn't like it when I refreshed, I guess. Okay, now they're gone. I have to delete the material there. Okay, so yeah, so now we have here environment light instead. We can see here, let's go in here, go to my shader and start to look at the Pixar surface. So we, in this section here, we have, this is the different shaders. That's, you know, the easy way to apply it. So we have Pixar surface, Pixar layer surface, that's a way to layer shaders. Marshner hair, that's for hair shading Disney as a more like the Disney's Uber material that was developed a while ago, and constant. So I usually use Pixar surface or layer surface when I create shaders. So in my case here, I pick Subsurface, and we have all of these settings. If I go into this, you can see here, all of these settings here is the actual shading here. So we can say color, roughness. So that's the roughness of the diffuse. This is the diffuse components. And we have settings here for, we can have bump per lobe. So we can bump the diffuse. We can have specular component here. So this is the specular. We have different ways to render specular. So we have artistic and physical. So this is two modes in Renderman. The artistic, you set this face and edge color to whatever you want. So let's say that you want to make a plastic or something. You have very little face and more edge color. Then it starts to behave like a plastic would do. Let's see here, if I place it, let's take my color here and go in here and say, if I turn it to black, we can see only the specular contribution. So the specular is kind of like reflections. If I raise the face, if I raise it up to 100%, you can see this one behaves as a metal, essentially. And the roughness here, let me see here. The roughness is how shiny the object is. So you can see here I've set it to 0. It behaves as a mirror. And I set it to 1. It essentially becomes purely diffuse again. So I usually map this to something. When I come up to these values, it doesn't really make sense to have that much roughness in general, unless you're doing very specific metallic stuff. Usually around here, I guess. And you rather than go up to the diffuse, have some diffuse instead. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. But then you have this specular Fresnel mode here. So let me explain that. So we have the artistic and the physical. So the artistic is a way to set it between 0, 1, and you set colors here. And the physical is something you insert a value, so you get that from a database essentially. So you can go to and search for IR values on the internet, and there you can see, okay, I want to have aluminium, and you can get a specific IR value for aluminium, and that's something you can insert into Maya and Renderman using this physical mode. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so refraction index here. For example, the edge color here, that's turning it on or off. So you want to usually have edge color to 1 when you use physical mode. And your refraction index is now dictating what type of material this is. For example, like a plastic or something, 1.5. If you have increased this to something like 10, it will essentially behave a bit like a metal, but metal then needs less diffuse to behave accordingly. But a metal has something called extinction coefficient that you really want to set for the real physical values. So let's take a look at that. So let's say that you have 1 point. So this is essentially RGB values. And let's say that you have red, green, and blue. Let's say that you have 3, I'm just making this up now, 2 and 1 point or 0.8. It looks very strange there. And then you stay in extinction coefficient. Let's say that you have 6, 4, and 2. And then you set your color to something, and then you get like a metal-ish. This now is a made-up value, but you can go to IR databases. So let's take a look. If I go here to search for IR database or something, refraction index. Org. This one, for example, silver. You can see here the different wavelengths. So 3D. Let's take 3D something. Metals, aluminium. You can see here the N and the K. So refracting index of aluminium, for example, you can see here 1.0972, and the K value, that's the extinction coefficient, that's 6.7942. So this is something that you can look up. And this is red, green, and blue, and red, green, and blue have different wavelengths. So that's something you also have to check out. Now, these values is something that you can actually usually have as presets. So that's something we can take a look at. I have all of these values set up into like a dictionary, but you can also save these as presets. And Renderman ships with like a library. So let's take a look at ways to do that. And let's take a look at the library here for, if I hit this guy up here, you open up a library. And that's essentially a way to use presets or already defined materials that's made by Pixar. And if you're welcome to the stream, if you're new here, I produce tutorials about lookdev, texturing, Renderman, and yeah, a little bit of everything. VFX. I work as a lead texture artist, and I've been doing that I've been working in VFX for 20 years or so. I started in 2000, so I've been working now for 20 years. So I have 2 years in schools, 2000 to 2002, and then I've been working in different facilities for 18 years after that. So yeah, and I produce tutorials and yeah, just hanging out here as well. So yeah, welcome. So yeah, let's take a look at, so we have here different materials, and that's something you can play around with. Some of them are artistic and some of them are using the physical. So let's see here what's artistic and what's physical. So if you just select, let's say that we want to apply something onto to this one here, we want to apply some metal. So let's go to metal. Let's take something cool here, nickel maybe. Import and assign material, and that assigns that. So that was almost the same value as I did there. Let's see here. Did it actually? Yeah. Essentially, I create a nickel without knowing it. Let's take these two guys here and select, apply something else. Some plastic maybe. Let's see, where do we have those? Plastic, glossy, green plastic, import and assign. There you go. I want to have something on this guy as well. PVC maybe. Import. There you can see. Just randomly assign some stuff here. These guys, let's see if we have some rubber or something. Okie dokie, here we go. Is this recording? It's in chat. Yes, it will be. All my live streams will come up afterwards. So if everyone can just go back later on. So no fear. It's gonna be on the channel later on. So that's fine. Let's take rubber. Blue rubber. Let's take pure rubber. And this material library, you can also store your own materials here. And also, as I'm gonna take this project into Houdini later on, you can actually store something in Maya here and actually bring it into Houdini. I haven't tried it myself yet, but I've heard that that's possible. It's a bit dodgy, I heard, in the new Solaris method in Houdini, but yeah, we'll get to that later on. So let's see here what type of materials I have here. If I now go here into my hypershade or something. Oops. I accidentally pressed the wrong button there. Let's go to hypershade. Let's see, I don't really like Maya's layout really, to be honest. I have never really found a good way to house hypershade. Let's see if I can dock it somewhere. It's gonna make it small and take a look at what I imported there. Just grab all of these and say graph materials and take a look here what we have. Where did I go? There we go. Rubber. Why isn't it importing my... Okay, graph network. There you go. Pure rubber. So let's take a look at what rubber is. It's using artistic. So let's take a look at the nickel. Where is my nickel? There we go. Graph network. Nickel is a physical. So let's see what refraction index Pixar had for nickel. So let's see here. So the nickel here was 2.367, 1.6, 1.4 in the IOR, and then we have this artistic or the physical extinction coefficient. So refraction index essentially the phasing, and extinction coefficient is the edge, like the edge. So usually you have in a metal, it's more reflective towards the edges, and that's the extinction coefficient simplified. Let's take a look here at, so we have 4.4, 3, and 2. Those are the physical values that we previously watched how we could find here on this refraction index database, refractionindex.org. So let's see if they have actually nickel and see what it says here. Metals. I'm not sure if they have it there. Can I search? other. Do I have it here somewhere? Nickel. I'm not sure where it is. There it is, nickel. So 1 point. So yeah, so this is, I talked about the different wavelengths. So the light, when you render like with RGB, you have red, green, and blue rendering. That's essentially what we do, and you have to look up each wavelength and take the values. So let's take a look here briefly here. So visible light spectrum, see what we get. Wikipedia. And see what wavelength we have. So here we have spectral colors. So red has a wavelength between 6.625 to 740 nanometers. So if I would want to look up in this refractive index, look up the red wavelength for nickel, I would need to go here and take a look here. Red, let's say 625, so I need to go here and say 0.625, and that will be 1.99 and 4. And then I need to write this down and say red, and then I need green, so 500.5 then 0.5, and then you take these values for green, and then you take the blue 4.5 or 5, insert that, and then you get the red, green, and blue components for the index or refraction and the extinction coefficient, and that is essentially what the physical values is for those type of complex materials. So a complex material will be anything like metals or of these type that has those two values. Artistic is easier to texture and do, you know, texturing for, but this one you need float maps to be able to drive with the map, or in most cases they are set as I do here using sliders, but if you want to map this you need to have float textures for it to work essentially. So yeah, let's take a look here and see what we got. Let's take this one and apply a one of these. Okay, so what else do we have? Let's go to one of these shaders and just take a look. Let's take the rubber here, pure rubber, just zoom in on it. So rubber, for example, could have some subsurface in it, so let's take a look at that. First off, just take this. I'm just gonna turn off selection highlighting here in my case, so I don't see this wireframe there. Here we have the color. So you see here I can change intensity, more or less specular, but you have different other effects here, so let's go through them. Here we have the specular. Rough specular is another lobe. So in Renderman you have different specular lobes. So the first one is usually used the primary specular. So that will be you know, like plastic usually have not like one type of effect, but you can start to mix different lobes. So you have something called rough specular. So let's take a look here at see here. If I set face color here and I dial here the roughness slider more or less, you can see here. So now it's quite shiny. Let's see here now if I go in, say here my rough specular and just dial up some of the face color there, you can see it. So it's set to 0.6, so that's a more, so now I essentially have two lobes here. So I have the primary and the secondary rougher specular. So that's a way to give even more interest. You can have a bit of a rough experience, and then you have maybe a slightly shinier lobe that contributes to give this, you know, more worked through and more in-depth material. That's kind of can be hard to achieve with only one specular lobe. And then you have clear coat on top. So let's say that you have two slightly rough specular components, and then you can use like a lacquer on top. So that's clear coat. So that's the third specular component in this shader that you can use. So that will be usually it's made for clear coats. It's more something that maybe you can have it less raindrops or sweat or car paint lacquer. So you usually have like a clear varnish on top of car paints, and that's usually something I drive with clear coat. Clear coat has some settings here with advanced. Let's see here. If I go to physical, so clear coat can also be tinted. So let's say that on a car you have a really thick clear coat, and then you tint it slightly, and that's something you can simulate here. So let's try that. If I now here go to my layer thickness and increase it, you see it goes dark here. And if I now start to play with my absorption tint here, so let's try that. So let's say that I say something like red, but I want something that's very little saturation here. So let's take HSV and just take something that's slightly tinted, and then I start to mess with my layer thickness, and I can get really interesting result here. Let's take layer thickness. Let's see, I should be able to drive it over 10. And then I start to saturate this. Let's see here. And I can get something that's really behaves more physical correct. So you essentially have, if you're looking through and an angle of this, essentially the thicker you have, the more you're looking through in a grazing angle. So it's going to behave a bit like it's darkening when you looking through the object. So that's another way to make car paint stuff materials in Renderman. You can use this, for example, that let's say that you would have something like a slightly gold. Let's create something goldish underneath here. So a tint this specular lobe here to something a little warm. So if I turn off my clear coat here, I take my edge color, turn it off. You see here, this is my let's create a gold out of this. So I turn off my diffuse and I create something here like this. I take some edge color and let's create something warm. Let's see, something like that. And now if I now turn on the physical clear coat again, you see I have the the pure metal surface, but then I knock it down here with this thick clear coat, and it behaves more like a car paint can do. You have this metallic contribution, but then you knock it down with this clear coat varnish on top. So that's a way to create another type of effect here in Renderman. Let's take this back, go to my edge, turn it off, set this back to something neutral here. Let's make something like a rubber again. Okay. Now we want to take a look at another type of effect you can use here in Renderman. So you have clear coat. I'm just gonna touch a bit. I'm not gonna go super in depth on all of this. We might come back more on that in the lookdev part. You have iridescence. That's kind of like a soap bubble, or a, you know, like a beetle or something. You can see these shiny grazing angles effects. So yeah, let's take a look at that. So iridescence. So you have the face and edge gain here. And the artistic mode is gonna take this primary and secondary color. So let's actually just look at the, if I turn this, my diffuse down there, so we can just essentially just see the colors. We can see here when I start to rotate, they're gonna start to shift between those two colors. If I change the primary color here and it's gonna be different looks. So now it's gonna cycle from, I guess, from that color to that. So the shift is not gonna be extreme. You want something that's essentially different in the color wheel, opposite colors of the color spectrum, so it cycles through all the colors if you want something that's more interesting. So let's say for example, if we will have that, so red, and in that case red and blue is kind of very far apart in the color spectrum, so you have to go through red through green to reach blue. So that's why you get this kind of that effect. The artistic or the physical, it's another way. So let's see the physical. Where is that one? There is the thin film thickness. So this is, you essentially drive the colors not through those two colors, you drive it through this thickness slider. So the more you have, let's take something 1000. This is similar to that clear coat. You have a thickness parameter. So let's take something. You can see here, the higher you get this number, the more of these type of rainbow effects you're gonna start to see. Let's take something really like 10,000, see what happens. Oh, now it's so many iterations, so it kind of goes rainbowy there. But I guess it makes sense. I think default is 800. I'm not sure if it's nanometers or whatever it is. That's the default, and when you increase it, it starts to band, so to speak. 2000, 200, 2000s. Yeah, it's a lot of experimenting with that. Let's turn it off and set these back. Okay, close iridescence and go to fuzz. That's a way to kind of mimic cloth or fibers or hair. So yeah, so you get a secondary lobe, and then let's see, it's really hard to see here. Let me turn this down and just have one specular lobe first. And I'm not gonna have that much specular. So let's make it pure diffuse now, and then just play with the fuzz and see what happens. Okay. And yeah, we need a fuzz color. So yeah, let's take, you can see here now it starts to behave almost like a velvet effect. You can see here on the grazing angle it kind of becomes a bit brighter there. So we can start to play with the cone angle. So the higher cone angle, it's gonna be even more effect, like you can see on velvet or some cloth. So I believe this one actually is, yeah, if you look at the tooltip, it simulates Marshner hair specular component. So yeah, let's tint this towards something and see. You can see now it starts to tint it towards this color. Yeah. Cheers. It's time to clear my throat. It's Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, really good one. Okay, back to it. The fuzz, so that's for simulating cloth and these type of effects, or sometimes I use it just, for example, like a dirty car or something, like finely powder or some of dirt. You can add it just to give it more patina. Subsurface, that's something we can take a look at. So we have here we have this slider here, and that's a ton of different subsurface, and I usually use Jensen dipole, that's the default, but I usually use exponential path trace or Jensen's dipole or non-exponential. But let's take a look at, just see here what happens. So just crank this up to 1 here, and it kind of looks a bit strange. So you have the color here. Let's take the color, and you can see here it starts to essentially bleed out here. But you have to, when you're dealing with subsurface or any of these effects, essentially in the current implementation of the Renderman shader, we don't have really compensation for something called energy compensation. We don't have it automatically. So that's something, if you gain subsurface up to 1, you kind of have to turn off diffuse. If you want to have subsurface to 1, you have to balance subsurface and diffuse. In this version, I believe that Renderman will come out with an update or something very soon, and I hope they have fixed that, so it more takes this relationship into consideration. So what you need to do, if you have subsurface at 1, you set the diffuse to 0. But if you have something in between, usually, if, for example, when you texture a character, you might want to have a bit of diffuse. So let's say that you have the gain here to 0.3. So the relationship between energy is, you should always, if you have something that's 1, you should never get more than 1 out. So that you can do a so-called white furnace test. That's essentially just taking a environment light and a sphere, and if you set the environment light to be 1 and you get 2 in your readout when you add your diffuse and your specular and everything, you know that you have more energy coming out than you are essentially putting into the object, and then you need to compensate. So what you do when you have subsurface and you want to use diffuse, for example here you set 0.3 in gain, you might want to do here subsurface to, so 0.3, then you would set this to 0.7, and that will balance this. The diffuse and the subsurface should always be 1, and when you add those 0.3 plus 0.7 is 1. So now it essentially has the right energy coming out there. And the color is essentially the color of the diffuse there. You also have this mean free path color. So that's, let me see. Yeah. Directionality, I'm gonna come more into this later on. Diffuse blend, this is a way to bring back some of the, essentially bring back a bit of diffuse. You have to remember that subsurface is one of these physical values that you need to be a bit, if I go here to, where is it, advanced scatter globals, unit length. So this is something you have to, depending on the size of the scene, you might need to tweak this. So if you read here, where is it, 0.1 if your scene is in millimeters. So let's say that you have another, if I search and if I replace this with 1, for example, you see the diffuse or the subsurface gonna look very different. So let's take a look. Set this to, I need to insert a value there actually, to 1. You see now it looks like super jelly, and that's because now my value here of the mean free path is 10 units, but I resample my scene scale here. So now this one is made for, I'm not sure if it's a meter or, yeah, it's the wrong scene scale. So now if I decrease this distance, this is how far into the object the diffuse or the ray hits before it starts to spread, essentially. So the longer you have here, the more rubbery the feel is gonna, you see, is it starts to dissolve here the edges of the object. So if I crease this, it's gonna look even more like some kind of rubbery toy there. So let's bring some color into this. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not gonna do any fancy with this. Just take a look at, you can do subsurface with this material as well. Let's turn it off and turn this one on. Take some specular. There we go. Glass. Yeah, so if you want to do a glass object, let's create something like a sphere or something so we can see it. Polygon sphere. Just gonna place it let's create a glass sphere here. So there's a few different ways to create glass. So you can either let's see here. What you can do here, for example, if you turn off diffuse, so a glass doesn't have diffuse, it's totally transparent. We go down here to glass. And we say refraction gain here. So this is the refraction part, but you see we don't have reflections, we just have a, and we can say reflection gain. And now we have a like a glass object. We can see here, you can see through it like a glass ball there. And you can say refraction colors if you want to tint this, for example. You see here, now it's a tinted glass. You can make it rough, so if you set it to 0, now it's like a super clear ball. If you set this up, it's gonna be like a frosted glass, like it's been a bit rough. There's also something here, where is it? Yeah, so extinction color, that's another thing that's kind of interesting. It's instead of using the refraction color, it's more, refraction color is like essentially like tinting it, but extinction is it's essentially a way to, if an object is thicker, let's do something here. Let's take this one. I'm just gonna turn on selection and highlight. Let's create something here on this sphere here. I just gonna ring select here and make another shape of this, so we can see this in action, see what happens. Let's turn on subdivision on this as well. That's gonna turn, so yeah, subdivision, that's another thing we can look at. By default it renders the polygons, but if you want to use something like a Renderman subdivision, you have to go to the sphere shape and go to the Renderman menu. Here you have a lot of Renderman specific attributes. One of them is actually, you can turn on subdivision. So you hear subdivision scheme. Let's take this Catmull Clark and it's gonna subdivide it. You can see here now it's subdivided. So let's go back to my surface here and take a look at the glass. Let's turn down roughness, so it's a clear glass-ish, like so. And now we want to mess with the extinction. So extinction is a bit, let's take something here. If you want to have a green refraction, you have to take the opposite color. So it's this is the color it will absorb. So if you want to make something red, you have to take the other 180 degrees around the color wheel to take the complementary color. So let's take a look. So let's say that you want to make a red glass. You have to essentially take the green color, because that's the opposite of red is green. So this is essentially where you, and the more saturated you see here, the darker it gets. So, and this is more physical correct rather than tinting it, because it behaves more with more physical appearance than just tinting it. So let's take a look at that. Let's create a duplicate and see the difference, see if we can make a difference. Let's create another glass. And now let's take the same roughness. What did I have there? 0.674. And now let's tint it. Let's see, and now also I need another. Yeah, it's actually rendered there with displacement. And you can see, if you look at the appearance here, it's richer in that. You can see that it absorbs more with the essentially when you use this absorption rather than just tinting it. I think it behaves more physical, and it's also a way to make murky water and stuff. So then you have to play with this other, where is that, albedo. It's kind of a way to introduce, you know, like silty water or something. You can use these effects, the scatter albedo and the extinction in conjunction to make, you know, like a murky water or something. So that's something you can also use. Let's see. Let's turn off refraction. Glow. Yeah, that's what it is. Essentially just creates, if you want to fake lights or something, you can map like a map to this and make you know, like it's not acting as a light per se, it's more like just illuminating. Global bump and stuff. So that's something we're coming into later. So that's a bit about that. What else? Let me see here. Do we have? Yeah. Just gonna check here. Okay, yeah, so let's take a look here. So that's about that. Let's we also have here different other type of shaders here. The layer surface, that's probably the one we can take a look at. Or actually, let's create a constant. And that's just a flat shader. So what I usually do constants for is to either create bake materials and stuff like that. So you can here under the mid color, if you hit this one and go to Renderman and say Pixar, we want a pattern, and we want utility, or let's see, Pixar excuse me, where is it? Pixar dirt. There you go. So that's an occlusion render now. So let's go in here. Let's say that you wanna render out occlusion or something. You can apply this one, and if you wanna have different colors here, for example, you can reverse it. So now it's rendering it with occlusion, and you see it doesn't pick up any lighting, essentially, just the occlusion. Doesn't matter what a light is with. You have inside, if you want to create something like a thickness or something like that, similar to like a thickness map. Let me see here. See if I can mimic that. There you go. I have to play here with the max distance and the falloff. So that's something you can play around with. Similar, you can also go back here and take a break connection here, or actually let's open up Hypershade again. And take the curvature Pixar. So yeah, you can just type here if you want to add any type of node here to your shader here. So this is the constant shader. Let's say you want to add a curvature. So curvature node is another way to create procedural effects. So let's take a look here what we have. Let me just scoot this around a bit here. So we have distance here again. This one is gonna be like if you wanna do effects like wear and tear, curvature is really handy. And you have to play around here with the bias settings and stuff like that. If you wanna do something like edge wear or something onto an asset, then you can use this pattern. So patterns and stuff that we're gonna come into when we do lookdev more. So yeah, I'm just gonna touch it now and show you if you go to here, the Hypershade, go to the Renderman section, you're gonna see a ton of different nodes and stuff. So Renderman BXDF, that's shaders, patterns. There you have different displacements, bump, utility, color ones, manifolds. So that's a way to, for example, repeat patterns, texture nodes, and this type of curvature and dirt. Let's create a layer shader. So let's delete this, and let's create a layered surface. Just take this one and right click and say layered surface. So a layered surface is similar to the Pixar surface, but it has layers. So each layer is its own surface. Then you can do stuff like, let's say that you have a metal in the bottom, and then you have a car paint on top, and then you have a mask that dictates where the metal and the paint is, and you blend between these with this mask, and that's usually where you use layered shading. So let's take a look at that. Okay, let's jump into Hypershade and see what was built there. There you go. Okay, I want to graph the selection. I'm going to take this and graph materials, and there we can see this is essentially what's built here. So this is what's applied onto the object, is the layered surface. And then we have a layer mixer, and then we have 2 layers. And the layers are the same as a Pixar surface. So if I take Pixar surface shader, essentially all the settings you have a Pixar surface, except some of the things you can only set on a global basis. And the global parameters lives in this node. That would be exponent of diffuse, or for example primary. If you can either have artistic or physical. You can't blend, you can't have physical in this layer and artistic in that one. You have to have the same, and that's something you set on a global basis, and that lives in this node. If you, for example, you have different type of specular lobes, you have something called Bachmann and you have something called GGX. GGX has a different specular fall off than Bachmann. Bachmann is better for really shiny surfaces, while GGX is better for anything with a bit of roughness in it. So the roughness have a nicer fall off. So that's something you set in this node. Let me just delete this one. The mixer is where you mix these 2 materials. So this one, let's say that I create a metal in the base. You can see here this material goes into the base, and this layer goes into layer 1. So you can then add more layers on top. So you can even then start to blend between multiple layer mixes if you want to have more than these 5 inputs here. So let's say paint. So let's create something that will be like that. Let's say artistic with GGX. First off, let's go to my layer mixer here, and let me just take this one, place it somewhere. Let's do so we can see it. And go to my, so this is settings. Let's take layer 1 here, that's the paint on top, and let's disable it. So I hit this enable button, so it's disabled. Now I'm dealing with my metal here. Let's create the metal. So let's do that. Just take 0 diffuse and make primary specular to something like so. Let's make like aluminium or something. And then we have I want to add like something on top, and that's my paint. Let's take this one, let's, whoops, layer 1, enable that one, and you see now it covers the metal completely. So let's create a like a green paint or something similar when I painted it. So let's create a bit muted olive. Something like so, maybe. Bit of yellow in it. Let's create a bit of specular as well. Just a tad. It's more like a paint on top of the metal. So you see here now, if I go back to my mixer there, if I now start to mess here with the mask, you can see here, if I start to, the more I put this to 1, so 1 is going to be fully covering, 0 it's going to be fully transparent. So this is where you would have then the metal in the base, and then you will have a mask saying, okay, where is it metal or where is it paint? And that's something you map to this guy here, the layer mask. We can test that by just taking a checker or something. You can see here now, you can see here where the checker is, I guess black is gonna be metal, and where it's white is gonna be paint. So that's the easy way. So that's another way. And then you can start to maybe add another layer on top of this if you want to. Let's say that you want to add another layer here. Let's see here. Create pixel layer. You see here now we have another layer. Let's enable that one. Let's create let's see here. I need to rename it to something. Decals. Sometimes what I've seen that I think there's a slight bug or something. If you rename your materials after you created it, and then you create a new material that has the original name, sometimes you have to enable and disable it. You see that I had some problem there, and that's something that I've seen. If you just then rename it to something else, it will start to work again. I'm not sure why this is, but yeah, that's something you have to take a look at. Let's create a blue or something. There you go. Some kind of refresh bug there sometimes. You can have something else now here in the layer mixer. Let's take another checker, but or let's take this bulge. Let's insert a threshold node or something. Yeah, so, and also here you can access solo here if you want to look at a pattern. If you hit the S button there, you will see the pattern on its own. So that's good when you want to tweak something like this. Let's say that you want to tweak this pattern, how it looks there. So I want to take this guy here, out color to input RGB, result into layer mask. It's a bit finicky here to sometimes reconnect this. And I want to check this guy out here. Okay, I want to solo this guy. So now I have a threshold here. Let's see here. You can see here, and I want to make it very crisp, and I want to have like a slightly different size here. Now if I unsolo this, we're gonna see blue dots on top of the green there. Let's zoom in. So the blue dots are essentially where my white dots are. If I go back here to my unsolo this threshold node here, let's see. Sometimes the solo, it takes a while for it to Let's see. Come on. Oh, there you go. See the white there is essentially where that blue layer is. And I can enable or disable that layer here in my layer mixer. So let's go to layer 2. So that's a way to build more complex materials and layer effects on top of each other. I'm gonna look into that when we do the lookdev part in the coming episodes. I just want to give a brief rundown on different concepts. What else do we have? So yeah, I'm not really gonna touch it now, but there's a few other utilities here. For example, TX Manager. That's a way to look into your scene, or when you render in Renderman, you use MIP mapped texture, and that's essentially it creates different levels of resolution. So if you have something that's far away, it takes a smaller resolution than if you are up close. So you can't just use any type of texture, you need the TX files, and that's something that it converts for you using this utility tool here. And you parse the scene. So if you have textures driving your shading, you can parse the scene, and it's gonna look through all of the file inputs and then start to convert those into Renderman specific textures. So yeah, that's something we will look at in the next episode. I'm not gonna use textures in this episode here because yeah, we're gonna look at that later. And we also haven't really touched anything about globals. So let's take a look at that briefly. Let's hit this guy. So I've been rendering with something here called the Renderman path Pixar, the path tracer, Pixar path tracer. So this is the different settings here for Renderman. We have the most common one is path tracer. It's meant to be optimized for outdoor lighting, but you also have other type of effects here called VCM. So VCM is a bidirectional path tracer, so it kind of trace backwards from the light as well as forward from. It's better for really complex lighting scenarios, indoor lighting and these type of things, when you can get a lot of noise, and sometimes this bi-directional way is actually more efficient for really diffuse type of lighting scenarios, where essentially if you have a light behind the wall that bounce around and all of these, then bi-directional path tracing might resolve quicker. But sometimes it also introduces a lot more noise, so you really have to judge where this is really working or not. Unified is, I believe it's a bit of an experimental integrator, so let's take a look. We can look at the different integrators briefly here. So default here, you see, doesn't really give any, it's really fast. If you want to fly around in your scene super quick, and just inspect stuff very rudimentary, you can switch this on to a default one. But you see, you don't get shadows and these type of effects. Direct lighting is it's a bit better than the default. You don't get, I think, diffuse bounces, so it's only the direct lighting, so it takes the lighting from a HDR, but you don't get indirect like color bleeding. So you don't pick up if a light ray hits this green patch here, it doesn't bleed off this green onto the floor here. But that's something that the path tracer will do. You see, you get more like a bounce lighting and color bleeding and all of that. So, but this one is more like if you want to do quick inspections, or maybe if you want to do a play blast or something that's quicker to render, this might be enough for you just to get a sense of what's happening. and then you switch it over to path tracing when you want to go final and have all of the bells and whistles. Occlusion is another mode, essentially like this occlusion mode that we looked at in the pattern. It's very fast, but yeah, it's just occlusion, so might be cool if you want to inspect something, or maybe make a play blast, use occlusion. Unified is this, I think it's still experimentary. It's supposed to be better for things with volumes and stuff like that. I haven't really used it in production. I'm mainly using path tracing or the VCM. And VCM will, for example, give caustic. So let's see, I'm not sure if it's gonna be seen here, but if you have a glass or something, you might start to see caustics on the floor, and that caustic is, for example, if you have a glass ball, you can see it kind of like a magnifying glass. It makes this like focusing the light beams and makes this hotter bright spot on the sun on the floor, for example, if you would have one of these. And it might start to actually give some extra, if you have a metal, it might start to shine onto the floor better. You might get more intensified light spill off if you have these type of effects. Okay. What else? Visualizer. So yeah, that's what it says. You can visualize. It's essentially the same as the default one here. It's very fast, but yeah, it's really meant for just to inspect some aspects of your shading or your model. You know, you can see, okay, what type of, how many groups do I have here, for example, or geometries. You can check your normals. That's UV, ST, that's UV's matte cap, not sure. Matte cap texture, haven't ever played with that one. Okay, I have to check that one. I rarely use this, to be honest. But yeah, it could be nice if you want to just inspect something, like look at the wireframe or something, just go around and see if you have problem areas. For example, I know that this one is really ugly here. You can see here, this one is a bad geometry. Okay, path tracing. Not gonna go into too much in depth in this one, but this is essentially where you set all your sampling. How when I rendered using this render view here, it's using the IPR settings here. So this is essentially 64 samples is the max it will go to, and the pixel variance, this is where you set how grainy it terminates at, essentially. So if you would set this to 0.1, it will try to spend more time, but I'm still limiting in by 64 samples in my case. If I would take something here 128, now it will take longer before it reach the max value, and it will essentially take away more noise, but it will also become slower. So that's not really the case when you render something. You really want a fast turnaround, so you have to look through a bit of the noise when you do this. So hopefully really soon here, I think Renderman is gonna have a release pretty soon. I saw that they're gonna release, I hope that they will start to support GPU rendering very soon, the XPUs that I have been talking about very, for a few years now. I hope it's around the corner, because now with the new graphics card from NVIDIA, it's gonna be very interesting to see if we can start to actually render with the GPU and Renderman. So yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to. hopefully this will be even faster resolve when we can start to limit or like leverage CPU and GPU together. Indirect bounces, and this is quality stuff. And let's see, specular. So this is essentially how many specular depth it goes, how many specular bounces and how many diffuse bounces. So if I take this one to 0, it's essentially turning off reflections. Indirect reflections. It's just gonna be the environment light. And if I set this to 1, you see now it starts to self. You see that now you can see the reflections from the floor there. When you set it to 0, you just don't see the floor reflecting into the metal there. And I set it to 2, now it's gonna bounce twice. So the higher you get here, the longer it's gonna take. Essentially, it's gonna be 7 bounces before it terminates. I think 4 is default. And the same here with diffuse depth. But turn it off here. Now there's no bounce. And if I set it to 1, you see starts to fill in the shadows there a bit. And the more I get here in my max diffuse depth, the more bounces, but it's also gonna take longer to resolve the image. But of course you get more quality, but somewhere, you know, like you have to have a trade-off. What's the max you can get to get the look you want, but still don't, you know, waste millions of render hours in production. So you really want to balance this closely depending on what type of objects you have. So yeah, gonna go more into this later on. Features, motion blur, for example. Let's 3D motion blur. Let's try and see if I can demonstrate that. Let's see here. I should be able to render, I guess, with motion blur. Let's see. Let's see if I key this one. Set the key there and I move it, and then we move it away, and then we set the keyframe somewhere in between. Let me see, if I go really far we should be able to see this. Do I have motion blur now? Should be motion blur. Let's see. Frame center. I thought that worked. Let me see. Is it because I wonder if it's because I'm doing the group. Let me try it on the sphere actually. Let's just debug this. Maybe it's... Whoa! Let me see here. Where is my sphere? There you go. Let me just hide this one. There you go. Let me render again. See here with motion blur. What's going on? Why do I have 2 dome lights now? And why isn't it rendering? Something is funky here. I'm not sure. Thought that was rendering. I must have broken the scene or something. Interesting. It's like it doesn't render anymore. Let me see here if I hit this one. Okay, there you go. Hide that one. My sphere should be animated. Okay, I thought you could actually have a rendered motion blur in IPR, or maybe that's a limitation to this viewport actually. Let me see. I think there's might be a slight difference. Let me open it here and take a look. Does it work in IPR? Yeah, it's a problem. It's a limitation in the render view. I think the render view actually use another version of Renderman called HDPRman. The IPR is slightly different. You can see here in the IPR, you can actually see the motion blur there. So if I tweak this down here, you can start to see the shutter angle. You're gonna see more of the, let me see, I might have to restart IPR for that to work. Yeah, it's one of these effects that needs a refresh. But you can see the IPR, it actually renders with motion blur there. Let's turn it off. Yeah, it's there's some settings in Renderman that's not supported in the render view here. That, yeah, okay, that's good to know. Renderman, going back here. Not gonna go into display filters and stuff other than you can actually add like post effects on to your rendering, and we can take a look at that later on. AOVs, this is for compositing and this type of effects. You can get your renderings out as a like you can have your specular and the diffuse and all of these effects coming out as separate, so you can combine them in compositing and break it out, so it's easier for compositors to actually do something with your renders, and that's something you set up, and we can take a look at that later on as well. Advanced, there's a lot of interesting settings here that's very high level, and essentially some of it, let's take here Renderman. You can see here when I, for example, one of the ones here, how it refresh the scene here. If I would take horizontal, it will go from up to down. If I go spiral, it's essentially goes from the middle out. It's just a way how it updates the scene here, for example. That's essentially but yeah, there's a lot of settings here that it's too deep to go into now. Workspace stuff that's also related to like your pipeline, where you render your images to, what type of names you want on your files, and these type of things. So yeah, that's a bit about that. There's a lot to go through, but in the next episode I will go into the look dev, starting to take a look at the look dev side of this asset that I previously textured in Mari. So I'm gonna take a look at both a way to have this monolithic workflow where I texture it for one shader. I'm also gonna break it out into layered materials. So I'm gonna have the metal on its own, the paint on its own, and dirt and all of this. So it's gonna be like a layered shader and a single shader approach. Both of them is something I'm gonna take a look at, how we can build these type of things in lookdev. So yeah, I think that's gonna summarize this live stream, and I hope you come back later on. I'm thinking maybe I will do like one live stream a week for a while to see how that goes, and I hope to see you again when I go live in probably next Sunday. I think Sundays is best because then I have most time to prepare, and yeah, take a beer together, and yeah, thanks for hanging out with me here today, and yeah, see you on the channel. Bye bye.